Hello, sexy people, and welcome to episode number 39 of Explode Your Coaching Business podcast, brought to you by gtex.org.uk. I'm your host, the one and the only Simone Vincenzi, and this is the podcast for coaches, speakers, and trainers who want to grow their businesses by making an impact in the world. To receive daily support in your coaching and speaking business, make sure you join our private Facebook group, Explode Your Coaching Biz, on Facebook. You can find the link in the show notes. And once you join, we will also send you, I'm crazy, I know, but we will send you the ultimate selling from the stage checklist, where we can help you selling from the stage more without being a douchebag. Today, I have the pleasure to interview Nick Morgan. Now, this is an incredible interview because Nick is one of America's top communication theorists and coaches. He's a passionate teacher, he's committed to helping people find clarity in their thinking and ideas and then delivering them with panache. He's been commissioned by Fortune 50 companies to write for many CEOs and presidents, and he has coached people to give congressional testimony, to appear in the Today Show, and to deliver an unforgettable TEDx as well. Now, he has worked widely with political and education leaders. He has seen himself spoken, lead conferences, moderate panels at venues around the world. And what I loved about Nick is that during the interview you can feel that he has experience and is one of the most experienced people I've actually ever interviewed so far. And his latest book, which I love, is called Power Cues, and it's all about how to use body language to become more powerful, a better leader, and have other people listening to you more. And it has literally been one of my favorite books that I've read in the past few months. Now, in this interview, we will talk about how to stand out when delivering a presentation, how to start your presentation, because you know that there is a crucial moment, which is the beginning, and either you stand out or you're mediocre or you bomb, so you want to stand out, and how to use your body language effectively to be charismatic with your audience, and much, much more. If you want to get in touch with Nick, there are all the links in the show notes on the blog that we have on our website, where you can find the episode on www.gtex.org.uk/episode-39. And also there is the link of the book. I would highly recommend to get Power Cues. I absolutely loved it. I'm listening to it in Audible. You can get it in paper copy or normal copies or audio. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, because of course we do this for you, and you don't want to miss any other episode on how to grow a six-figure coaching and speaking business. And if you have any question for me, you say, Simone, you look cool, I would love to send you a message and see what you can do for me and for my business, then you can reach out to me at simone@gtex.org.uk. That comes straight into my inbox. And with that, let's start the music. Hello everyone, and welcome to Explode Your Coaching Business Show. We are episode number 39. Wow. And today I have the pleasure to interview the one and the only Dr. Nick Morgan. Nick, how are you doing today?
I'm grand. How are you?
I am incredibly well. Good. So now, before we were just having a quick chat, and you have been skiing recently, right?
That's correct. Yes, my muscles, my aches and pains are telling me that was the case, so it must be true.
For how long have you been skiing now?
You mean when did I start?
When did you start?
I started when I was about 5. My dad was a keen skier, but I've only skied off and on since then when I've had the chance. So it had been a few years, and as a result, I was a bit rusty. It was not a pretty thing at first. It took me a while to get back in the groove.
But then you managed to get back in the groove, apparently.
It came back to me, about halfway through the day before my muscles gave out and I got tired. There was a while there, shortly after I'd had the hot chocolate and the sugar for lunch. I had this kind of burst of energy, and it went great. I was in the groove, yeah.
There is nothing that a good hot chocolate cannot solve.
Exactly. I
Now, we're not
recommend
yet
sugar.
against every dietitian.
Yes.
We're not here to talk about sugar. We
That's
are not
right.
here to talk about chocolate.
This is not a diet show. This is
It's
something
not a
else.
diet show. We are talking about public speaking. Now, you have been, you had an incredible career, and you're still having an incredible career as a public speaker trainer, and you're considered as one of the top America's communicator, and you've been working with Fortune 50 companies. And the question that I want to ask you is, what makes a great speaker?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and of course I could talk for hours about it. So I'll try to keep it short, and then we can dive into whatever's of most interest to you. But I would say, in summing it up in some way, that the most essential quality that a great speaker has to have is, in addition to, of course, a brilliant message, is consistency between message and intention. And by intention, I mean the delivery side of it, the body language side of it, the emotional side of it. Because what happens so often when speeches don't go well, it's because the speaker may have written a good speech, but then in terms of the delivery, he or she is not fully present. They're not 100% there. And it's harder than you might think to perfectly align content and delivery, and that's really what makes for a great speaker. When you see that happening, when you see the speaker completely in charge of his or her material, and then also in charge of his or her delivery, it's a beautiful thing, and it all works. And I say, what I work with my coachees on is becoming an intentional speaker, and by that I mean knowing who you are and where you are at all times. So when you stand up, you're making the impression that you want to make, not some other impression, or not something you haven't thought about. I mean, the classic one, obviously, is the person who staggers up on stage and looks terrified and says, "I'm really happy to be here today." Now, their content is that they're happy to be there, but the body language clearly says they're not. And you don't have intention there. You don't have a successful speech. Now, of course, we're all willing to forgive a little bit of nerves at the beginning of a speech, but we expect the speaker to get over that, and so that's a simple example. But it's usually more complicated than that. It has to do with when you're in the middle of your storytelling, and are you matching the emotions, the appropriate emotions to the story that you're telling, and that can be harder than people realize.
And is this easy? Is this something that comes natural to people? Is it something that can be built? This creating this harmony between the message and the delivery?
No, it's not natural at all. It's something that has to be learned. I think some people start out a little better than others at it, but what you intend and what you think is showing up on stage are often two different things. I'll give you a classic example. Back in my acting days, I had my first big break as a stage actor, which was to do a regional revival of a show called The Heidi Chronicles, which had been a big Broadway hit. And this was about 10 years later, and it was going to be revived. And I had the lead role. The first day of rehearsals, fortunately this happened in rehearsals and not on opening night, but first day of rehearsals, I had to do a love scene with my co-star, whom I'd never met before. And I was all excited about that as a amorous young man. I thought this is a great opportunity. You get to do a love scene with an attractive starlet, and about halfway through, I thought I was doing a great job, and the director blew a whistle, and he said, "Nick, stop! What are you doing?" And he used several expletives, which I won't use on your G-rated show. He said, "Morgan, what the bloody blah, 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 blah are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean? I'm doing a love scene." And he said, "Look at your feet." And what I didn't realize was my feet were wandering all over the stage. And it was a simple, obvious thing once you pointed it out, but my nerves and my energy and enthusiasm were showing up as what we call in the business happy feet. I was wandering around. You can't make love to a woman or vice versa with feet wandering all over the stage. You just can't do it. It was ridiculous. But I was so into my performance and so excited.
I'm sure you were into it.
That I didn't even realize until he pointed it out, and then I felt like the stupidest performer in the world. So a simple example, and your audience, I hope, will learn from my painful experience, but the idea is that it's harder than you might think to align intention, content, and performance because all kinds of things get in the way of just being there and being purely focused on what you need to focus on.
And Nick, if I'm starting as a speaker and I want to become great, where do I need to put my focus at the beginning? Is it in the intention? Is that in the content? Is that in the performance aspect? Where do I start?
Yeah, there are a lot of things you have to get right. That's what's hard about public speaking. If it were easy, I wouldn't have a business.
There are 500 things that you're doing at the same time without people realizing it.
Exactly, but the key ones are, and this may surprise your listeners, the first thing to think about is your audience, is who is your message intended for. Not all messages are great for all audiences, and it's like book authors. When a publisher asks an author, who's your book intended for, the typical response from the author is, well, everybody. Of course, I want everybody to read this book, but that's not a good answer. And it's not a good answer to say everybody should hear my speech. Again, just to take a very simple example, I worked with a gentleman who had been in one of the secret armed forces, special forces kind of groups, and he was speaking about how that kind of, in the U.S. Delta Force training can be helpful in the business world.
Right.
And that's a great topic. His first invitation was to speak to students. And while the students were certainly ready to be excited and thrilled by the kind of gory stories he was going to tell, they weren't really ready emotionally to hear the kind of mature, and this is to take nothing away from students, but his audience really needed to be middle managers and above who had struggled for a number of years. And his message, while it was kind of thrilling to meet a guy in uniform who had done these cool things, it really didn't resonate deeply with those high school students and college students. It was just the wrong audience. But that happened to be the first place that, for various reasons that don't matter here, that happened to be where he got his first invitation. It just didn't make sense for him. And yet that's not obvious, right? If somebody asks you, and you were that guy, do you want to talk to a college audience? Your answer would be sure, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Why not? Say to them, yeah.
I'm there.
Yeah. But as a great practice, if nothing else. But it turned out it wasn't. It just was not the right audience. So the first thing you have to think about and think deeply about, really, is who is my audience? And if you can't say who my audience is not, then you haven't really thought about it. If you're not ruling out some people, then you haven't really thought about it. And then, of course, the second thing is, what's that message that is so essential that I want to do the hard work that it's going to take to change the world over? The only reason to give a speech is to change the world, and that's hard work, and it's also a great opportunity, and it's not worth putting in the time and the effort and all those hours unless you care passionately and deeply about it. So that's step 2, is figure out what you're going to say, and like I say, it'll surprise some of your listeners to perhaps to hear that I think audience is step 1, but I do. Audience is step 1, message is step 2, and then step 3 is figuring out. That's when it starts to get complicated. There are many things, but it's figuring out what are the emotions, what are the emotional touch points, what are the stories I'm going to tell, what are the real guts of this message that I have that are going to really change that world, to move the audience to a new kind of action, to a different place than they've been before. That's the real opportunity of a speech, is you can change the world. You can change the audience in front of you. And so you got to know where you want to take them. And that's, again, something that most people haven't thought about. I just want to give a speech. I want to tell people my great ideas. No, the question is, what do you want them to do differently as a result of having heard your speech? And if you
what action do they need to take?
Exactly. And if you don't know the answer to that, you're not ready to talk yet. So that's the next step. And then after that, there's endless sets of what kind of technology do I use, and do I use slides, do I use video, do I use dancing dogs, what do I use to put on the show, and so on.
I never used dancing dogs, and now you gave me an idea.
There you go. This is it. This could be a big breakthrough.
That's my big break. Thank you, Nick. You made an impact. You already made an impact in a few minutes.
Thanks.
Definitely in my life. Now, let's say I already know my audience. So I did my homework. I know what my audience is, and I know what is the main message that I want to deliver. I know that the action that I want to inspire people to take, and the result that I want them to get at the end. Now, what ways do you suggest from your infinite experience, to create a message that can get people, that can captivate people, that can get people wanting to listen more, really hungry for more? What would you suggest?
Well, it comes down to a few classic moments that are especially important. All moments in a speech are important, but there's some that are more important than others. And I always use with my clients the example of James Bond movies, because I'm only slightly ashamed to admit that I'm a huge James Bond fan, and I always start by asking, how did James Bond movies begin? And people have various answers, but for somebody who's actually seen the movies, they'll eventually get to the idea that the way a James Bond movie begins is with a really expensive car chase or set of explosions. There's a person or people in peril, and it totally grabs your attention, and it frames the rest of the movie. It tells you where the rest of the movie is headed, and in particular, it was about not the last one, but about two Daniel Craig Bond movies ago was, I think, the best opening ever for a Bond movie. It began in some unnamed European town, and the camera begins moving over water and then comes up to a tunnel, and you soon realize that what's happening is that there's these two cars going at incredibly high speed, chasing one another inside a tunnel with traffic going in both directions, and the excitement and the claustrophobia of that, and it's not just your standard car wrecks like you'd see on a highway, right? This is inside a tunnel, so it's even worse, and it's just absolutely brilliant framing of what's going to happen next. Totally hooks you, and the ideal opening to a speech does the same thing. You don't want to waste those opening moments, because that's when the audience is paying the most attention. And I see speakers all the time, and I've blogged about this, make three classic mistakes. So they'll talk about themselves. How many speeches have you heard that begin with,
"Oh my God,
let me tell you a little bit about me"?
Hi, how you doing? Now it's let me hear my story. It's like, I don't care.
The audience does not care. They want to know what's in it for them. They don't care about you. I mean, of course, they care about you like any other person, but they don't deeply care about you. And any person who starts a speech saying, "Let me tell you a little bit about me," already they're going to tell you more about me than you wanted to know. So that's the first thing. The second
2 hours later,
exactly,
all their story, and you haven't not learned anything.
Yeah, the second thing is, and this one, people get this, but then I've worked with experienced speakers who really have a hard time giving up this one. I call it throat clearing. So they'll walk out on stage and they'll say, "Hey, how is everybody today? How you feeling?" "Great, so good to be here. Anybody here from Indiana?" "Oh, great, because I see a couple of my friends from Indiana. Isn't that great?" And they do this, it's throat clearing. They're just sort of chit-chatting. They're actually squandering the maximum audience interest and focus. And what they'll say is, they'll push back when I say you shouldn't do that. You should just launch right into your speech. And they'll say, "No, I'm establishing rapport with the audience." And that sounds good. Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? Until you realize that, no, that's not actually what they're doing. Actually, what they're doing is trying to make themselves feel good. They're trying to burn off a little of that nervous energy they've got at the beginning. And that's not a good reason to waste time in front of an audience. And so what speakers find when they finally let go of that urge to just do that throat clearing, that chit chat, is that they make a much more powerful connection. And the third mistake that people make at the beginning that will really surprise some of your listeners is that they'll give an agenda. Let me tell you what I'm going to talk about. And people are surprised because they say, well, isn't that just a common courtesy? Wasn't it nice to give people an agenda? And my response to that is, you watch the behavior of people in conferences today as much as I have, and you will see that what people do as soon as somebody says, let me tell you what I'm going to talk about, as soon as they put up an agenda slide, here's an agenda, what they'll do is they'll go back to their cell phones, their mobile phones. They'll go back because they'll think, okay, this guy's just doing the agenda. He's not actually starting yet, so I can do one more email or one more text message before the show actually starts. And so, once again, you squander that interest. And that's because people these days are so time deprived and so attention overloaded that you give them a second to go away, and they will. If instead you just begin with your story like a James Bond movie, you start with a claustrophobic chase scene with two really expensive cars crashing into each other, and we're going to pay attention, right? So your story, your opening has to be that good. Don't waste it, and that's one of the key places. And then other place, of course, the ending is another key place in a speech that has to be good, and we can talk about that. But the key way that you connect with people in speeches is, of course, telling stories. And if you don't have good, strong emotional stories to tell, then again, you're not ready to speak yet.
Is there any speaker that, or maybe something that you did yourself as well? I leave the question open, that gave a beginning or an introduction where you were wowed, that you were mesmerized, that you wanted to stand up and shake the speaker's hand. I mean, as speakers, sometimes we know we can recognize the craft, we can recognize the hard work. And sometimes if someone is doing a great job, I just want to stand up and shake his hand and say, or her hand, and say, you know what, you're blowing me away. Is there a moment that ever happened to you like this? And if yes, which one?
Yes, I can give you an example, one that I thought we really killed it, and this was worked out in conjunction with a client of mine. And so you have to imagine big conference, 2,000 people in the audience, right? And so this is one of these scenes with the huge iMake screens and lots of theatrical elements to it. And so when I say the audience and the stage go dark, then it's going to go black like in a theater. Okay, and so the first thing that happens is everything goes dark, audience hushes, and then a spotlight comes up toward the back of the stage on a single person, and he's holding a bass guitar, electric bass guitar, and he just starts playing this really kind of moody, funky, moving bass line, boom, 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 and the rest of the stage is dark. And then, because your eye is drawn to that, you don't see the speaker who comes on the stage then in the dark with his guitar. And after the bass player's been going for a little bit, the light comes up on our speaker, and he's holding a electric guitar, and he starts playing his jazz riff over that bass line. And then he says, and then he stops after it goes a little bit, and he says, "Let's talk about creativity." And it just blew the audience away. They were completely captivated, and it was the best. That was the best, and there was a little more to it than that. I won't go into the details, but that was the best introduction to a talk about creativity in the workplace that I've ever been involved in or ever seen. And I give full credit to my client, because he had to be able to play a mean jazz guitar to be able to. Yeah.
You could put the pieces together, but the skill of playing a guitar, you had to do. And I think it's so crucial bringing in the element, and we're going to talk about performances later, and the element of performance in a speech. I think it's so crucial bringing all the other extra skills that you have, in particular in this moment. I remember for the first time when I did my TEDx talk, I started my TEDx with a didgeridoo. And
Awesome.
I'm
I've seen that.
quite
Yeah, that's really great.
right.
Yeah.
And after I've seen the reaction there. I start playing the didgeridoo normally, and then I start beatboxing on a
Right.
didgeridoo, and the audience is there. The only thing I'm doing in that moment, I'm just spending a few words to put some context and also to create some banter with them.
Mm-hmm.
But they are watching me playing the didgeridoo, and now every single time I'm on stage, I have either this one, or I have another piece where I do a piece of breakdancing on the stage. Because, as you said, the beginning is the most important part. But I've wasted so many talks and speeches where I started like, "Hey, how you doing?
Yep,
Is
exactly.
everything all right? Did you travel from far? Oh, there was this train strike. It
Yeah.
sucked, right?" It's
Yeah.
like, oh, what a great way to start an event.
Yeah, and you also found that music is one of the special things about music is it immediately cuts right through to the emotional circuit
Yes.
of the brain, so it moves the audience immediately, and in a way, it's kind of I wouldn't call it a trick. Because it has to be relevant to the talk. You can't just get up and perform a little bit and then go into your speech. If there's no relationship between the two, the audience will cry cheat. But if you figure out a way to connect those two so that it does feel like a relevant frame, then it's instantly powerful because music is such a powerful thing for us.
And after we...
But I don't want, by the way,
Yeah.
I don't want your
Okay.
listeners all to go out then and put music in. That's not the message here, to put music in at the beginning
Yes.
of their speeches. Because in the case of my client, he was an honest to God jazz guitarist, had been a professional
Yes.
since age 12, and it was completely relevant to his message on creativity. In fact, the message was about how jazz follows rules and then yet, of course, ad libs. Improvises around the rules, and that was his model for how you introduce creativity in the workplace. So it all fit together very well, and your didgeridoo fit in that speech in the same way. So
Yes.
that's the key here. It's not the message here is not just go out and play some music. Come in to the sound of Rocky, the Rocky soundtrack, something like that.
Just because it sounds cool.
Just because it's cool. Yeah, I'm afraid that's too cheap a trick. You can't do that.
Thank you for clarifying, Nick,
Yeah, please.
because they never assume, ever assume, because I think it's a great point.
I don't know if
Now-
you ever saw The Office, but the original one, the UK version. But there's an episode I encourage all your listeners to Google, where he does a motivational speech. David Brent does a motivational speech, and he walks in with a boombox and he sets the boombox down and he plays this. We are the champions or something like that, and it's just so cheesy and stupid. It gets at what's really bad about speaking when there's no real justification for it. It's just because he had a boombox. Yeah, so please don't take that message away. Don't
do it.
yeah, don't do it. Don't try this at home.
Be supervised. Now, we talked about how to create a captivating beginning, how to captivate the audience at the beginning, and the importance. And it feels like someone who is listening right now can think, well, so do I need to be a performer? Do I need to be a musician? Do I need to do breakdancing like that crazy Italian dude? Do I need to do something quirky or different? Do I need to be a performer to be a great speaker, or can I be a great speaker without being a performer?
The answer is absolutely. You can be a great speaker without being a great performer in some other venue or some other style or like a musician of some kind. You do have to be a storyteller, I think. You have to be a good storyteller because your other option, if you're not going to begin with some sort of musical performance, and most people don't, most people shouldn't, is to begin with some kind of storytelling. And I mean storytelling there in the broadest sense. There are all kinds of ways to tell stories and to engage people. But the point of a story is facts plus emotion. And stories make us engage and say what happened next. And if you're not doing that, then the audience won't care. If that audience isn't sitting there thinking to himself, yeah, and then what happened next, then you haven't got them. So you've got to be a good storyteller at the minimum.
Okay, now I'm going to be a bit cheeky here, and I'm going to ask you: do you have a story that you use in your speeches that you know as a speaker what story works and what story can really capture the audience? Do you have a story that you tell in your speeches that you can even give us a glimpse here on our show?
3 things happened to me when I was 17 that led to my lifelong interest in body language and communications. First, I read a book about the Dalai Lama, and he became a hero of mine. Second, I learned my father was gay. And third, I died. And let me tell you about those 3 things in order. And then I go on, and that's the opening of that story. Did that engage you?
Wow.
Do you want to know how I died?
I'm in.
Yeah, so there you go. I'm in. That's my story. That's the beginning of my story.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think this is a great example of storytelling and how can people start a speech. And also think this is a great example of preparation. Because I asked you a question. You were ready. Like I felt. I didn't see you, but I felt the change in your voice. I can also imagine the change in your posture while you were telling the story right now.
There you go.
And I think that this is the importance of practice. This is the importance of preparation, of telling the stories over and over and over again. Now, if
that's absolutely right. And I would say one other thing is the stories have to be authentic in some sense. And authenticity is an overused concept, and it's an overused word. And of course, there are cultural differences from one country to another. We Americans tend to be more immediately open than some other countries. But still, that story is powerful for audiences because there's a real authenticity in it for me. It was hard the first time I told that story. It took me a long time to develop it. It was hard for me to talk about the moment when I found out my father was gay. That was very emotional, and it all ended well.
I can imagine.
But it was a big deal in my life, obviously, to find that out. So it's a real story, and that you can't just stand up and tell the footsteps on the sand story, or the Lucky Tailor, or the 3 Little Pigs. I mean, it used to be business speakers especially could stand up and tell these chestnut stories that have been told many times before, or old parables or old fairy tales or something like that. You can't get away with that these days. The standards have been raised. People expect real stories, the stories that have some grit to them and some reality to them. So that's another note, by the way. Become a good storyteller, but don't be telling that same story that the footsteps in the sand that people have told for 25 years. That will not do it.
Don't tell a Harry Potter story.
Yeah, exactly.
Leave it to J.K. Rowling.
yeah, he knows how to do that well.
Nick, what is the difference between a personal story, starting with a personal story, or with a third-party story? In the context is the impact that I'm leaving in the audience, that I'm having in the audience while I'm telling the story.
Yeah, I think there's risk and reward for telling personal stories. The reward is that you can be very authentic, and you can really grab your audience, and you can show them that you are a real human being, and you've got flaws, and you had struggles too, and all that. The risk is that you won't tell that kind of story. The risk is that you'll just end up sort of sounding like you're bragging. Then I won the Academy Award, and then I won the Golden Globe, and then I did this, and then I did that. Right? These are not stories that people want to hear. We don't want to hear how wonderful you are. So that's the risk, that if you open with a personal story, it can look self-centered. The story has to be a story about your struggles, not about your triumphs. Otherwise, we're going to very quickly get turned off. And so when I tell that story about how I died, it's clearly not one of my better days. So people are interested, and they accept that, and they find it fascinating because of what actually happened. Whereas if I had said, "Yeah, I won this award," or "I did that and it was really cool," then they would not be engaged. So it's a debate I often have, a discussion I often have with clients, is we talk about, do we want to start with a personal story, and if so, is that story strong enough, and does it show our hero vulnerable enough, and is it a story that can generalize to everybody else's experience in a way that works, or are we going to start with a third person story? And often the answer can be we end up starting with a good third person story, because we do want to avoid that risk of sounding like, hey, this is all about me, this is self-centered. That you don't want that. That's a very quick turnoff for an audience. So it varies, and they're good personal stories and they're bad personal stories, and you've got to pick the good one.
Thank you, Nick. And the reason why I've asked this question, it is one day I was sharing the stage with a great speaker, and he had and very interesting to use a nice word, a very interesting personal journey. You know, all the crap that can happen to a human being actually happened to him.
Poor guy.
And and he turned his life around completely. So well done him. And he was speaking after my talk, and my talk was very lighthearted. And he started going into his story. And I think that his story has great messages and can get people. However, what I found is that 20 minutes later, he was still talking about all the things that happened to him. And the energy in the audience was over. Everyone wanted to kill themselves at that point. It's like people couldn't really believe, didn't really know if they wanted to cry, if they wanted to laugh at this poor guy. So where is the limit? How do you choose, if you're using a personal story, how much to say and how much is too much and how little is too much? What is your criteria?
Well, several. First of all, that opening story wants to be about 3 minutes long, assuming an hour speech or 45 minutes to an hour speech, if you've got that kind of time slot. If it's a TED Talk, it's got to be less. You really only have about 60 seconds to get launched. And people, and in fact, it's gotten to be a problem in TED Talks. People complain that way too many of them are just all about the personal journey, and sometimes the personal journey, as you say, is harrowing and it's moving and it's wonderful the way it comes out, and we do want to hear it. But back to the original sad but very true statement: audiences care about what's in it for them. They don't care about the speaker in that way, and so when you said 20 minutes, your other speaker had gone on for 20 minutes, I immediately knew he'd gone on too long. So there's a simple time factor there. If that opening story, if it's going to go more than about 3 minutes, it better be really good, and it better broaden out to beyond just your issues. And the thing people forget about stories too is stories have to show change. That's the point of a story. Is to show change, and most people think they're telling stories. They're actually telling anecdotes, and they're not stories. A true story involves a change.
What is the difference?
Of the hero.
What is the difference between a story and an anecdote?
Well, here's an anecdote. So I was in New York the other day, and I went into the grocery store to get something, and standing in front of me was a famous movie actor. So that's an anecdote. That's not a story, because there's no change there.
There is no evolution.
Nothing happens. Yeah, it's static. It's a situation. Now, if the movie actor turned around and started chatting with me, and it turned out we had something in common and we ended up becoming buddies, I could tell that story. It might be really awful. It might sound like I was name dropping. It might be a terrible story, but at least it could turn into a story. But just that anecdote is not a story. And yet I have heard endless numbers of business speakers tell those kind of quote stories, unquote, thinking they were telling stories. They're actually just anecdotes, because nothing happens. Stories need conflict, and that's the other thing that business speakers often shy away from, because they just want to produce happy endings. They don't want to create conflict, or they don't want to admit or talk about conflict. So a story needs conflict, and then it needs a resolution. We need to see a change in the hero, whoever the hero is, whether the hero is you or the hero is somebody else. It's a third-person story. A story at minimum needs conflict for the hero, and then some kind of change. We need to see the hero making a decision or deciding to act differently in some way that shows a genuine change. That's a story, and those are always interesting. We always care about human motivation and human decision making, and good stories have an astonishing variety of situations and different things at stake and whatnot, but the key elements are the hero, the conflict, and the decision or resolution to that conflict. And without that, you don't have a story, you just have an anecdote.
Now, Nick, I have this burning question right now. What happened the day you died? Now we're talking about story. You got me. I had this question since you hugged me. You did your job.
Yeah.
Hats off to you.
Thank you.
But now you got to tell us.
Okay, so I was tobogganing with some friends, and we got down the hill the first time, the three of us on the toboggan, and I was 17, I'm being a young jerk, I said, hey, we didn't go fast enough. So they said, well, you take the run by yourself if you think you're so cool. So I did, and I got a running start, jumped on the toboggan, made it around the first curve. I didn't make it around the second curve. I crashed into a tree. I fractured my skull. I was airlifted to a hospital, and I'm only alive today thanks to the efforts of a brilliant neurosurgeon who saved my life. And I was unconscious. I was in a coma for about a week. And during that week, I flatlined for about 15 minutes. It was just like in the movies. All the monitors on me, instead of going beep beep beep, started going beep, and everybody came running in and gave me the shocks and things to get me back, and they brought me back. So I'm lucky to be here. But what was the relevance to communications is that when I woke up, something had changed. Something had been jarred loose in my brain, apparently, and I could no longer read people's body language in the way that everybody automatically can. So if you walk into your family or a bunch of friends that you know very well, you can instantly sense a mood if there's a strong mood there.
Yes.
Like if they're overly angry or if they're really happy, you pick up on that. You don't have to do any conscious work. You don't have to look at each person and think to yourself, so-and-so looks happy today because he or she has a big smile on his face, and therefore I deduce. No, you don't have to do any of that. You just get the vibe, right? I could no longer get that vibe, and I had to train myself to study body language. It took me about a year of retraining in order to relearn that, so that something would wake back up in my brain. It was in my unconscious mind that had gotten damaged by and so that's where I got my interest in reading body language, and I had to study it much harder than most people do. Most people can do that automatically without thinking about it with people that they know, but I had to train myself to do it, and that process was what led to my lifelong interest in body language.
Wow, that's fascinating, and I believe that everything happens for a reason, and I was really fascinated by the talk at Stanford University from Steve Jobs, Connecting the Dots, which I'm sure you are familiar with.
Sure.
Connecting the dots for you, why do you think that happened?
I think, if I'm being really brutally honest, I think I was a thoughtless, selfish 17-year-old who had a lot to learn about connecting with other people, and I think I learned that as a result of that horrific accident.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. In your career as a speaker, I mean, we can mention many of your books. I can mention definitely the last one, which was the one in 2014, Power Cues.
Power Cues, yep.
The subtle science of leading groups, persuading others, and maximizing your personal impact. And you're known in your industry to be a bit controversial, to challenge the conventional thinking. What made you write your books, and in particular Power Cues, and what is that you talk about in that book in particular?
Well, I stumbled on some research, two pieces of research actually. One was done is still being carried out by a team at Princeton University in the U.S. that found that when you link up the storyteller and the listener, and they put all those electrodes and whatnot on the brains of both the storyteller and the listener. They found that when a storyteller starts telling us a good story, a classic story, the listener's brain pattern matches the storyteller's exactly. And what's more, so it's actually a form of mind control, if you will. And it answers a question that many people have of, when I talk about my experience, does the other person actually understand it, or do they just hear it in their own way, and do they hear completely different things? You know what I mean? It's a question that many teenagers have asked themselves. Does anybody really understand me? Right? And as you get older, you ask different versions of that. You wonder if other people share your experience or not. Yes. And it's a famous philosophical question. When you use a word like Paris, that word has a very different set of meanings for a Parisian who lives in the city and knows it intimately compared to somebody who's only visited once as a tourist, right? So what do we mean by the words, and what do we mean when you tell each other stories? Do we experience the same thing? And this research answers that question. Yes, we do, because our brain patterns then turn out to form exactly the same images. And then the really interesting part of that research, though, is what happens at the end of the storytelling. Just before the storyteller gets to the end of the story, the listener starts anticipating where the story's going. So the listener's pattern forms milliseconds before the storyteller's pattern does, and so there's a real kind of transference of human connection in storytelling, and that tells us something really profound. So when I read about that research, I thought, I've got to bring more of that neuroscience to discussion of communications, because there just wasn't any other book out there about neuroscience and communications. There have been a lot of books written about neuroscience and decision making and neuroscience and public policy and so on and so forth, but nobody had written the book on neuroscience and communications, and that's why I wrote Power Cues.
It's definitely a book that I'm going to buy and I'm going to read, because I'm probably going to go through all the other books that you have. I think you're blowing me away with this interview, and I'm sure that you're blowing also everyone else that is listening to this interview away. Now, talking about you, what has been your and these are the few questions before we wrap up the interview. What has been your biggest failure as a speaker? that moment where you really wanted to die. Not that happened, but you really wanted to. If you ever had one. You mean besides the time when I was acting and got interrupted in the middle of my love scene? Beside that, unless it's that one.
my most recent memorable failure. There's so many, it's hard to remember them all. But my most recent one was a couple of years ago, and I was talking to a large Fortune 500 company to their marketing division. Excuse me, and the organizers had a lot of agenda items they wanted me to insert in the speech. And by the time we got done, the speech was out of control. There was the stuff I had originally planned to say and that I care about and that I'm knowledgeable about, and then there was a whole bunch of messages that the company organizers wanted me to insert in the speech, because they thought if I said it to their audience, that their audience would get the message. And really what they were doing was they were just being lazy. They didn't want to do the hard work of persuading their employees of the direction the company was going to go in. That shouldn't have been my business, and I should have pushed back. And this is a message to any professional speaker, is yes, you want to customize your speech to particular audiences, but don't get so far off your message and what you're passionate about that you end up delivering somebody else's speech, as I did essentially that day, because you're not going to do well. And I didn't, and it was not a pretty picture.
Thank you for sharing. And now, flipping the coin, what has been your biggest success as a speaker? The moment where you would do like triple backflips in your living room if something happened, or where was your best moment as a speaker?
Well, I want to say, I mean, it was actually another Fortune 500 company, so it was another big, high stakes audience, and it was the first time I told that story about fracturing my skull, and I was very uncertain as to how the audience would react to that. I'd never tried to tell that story before, and they seemed to be hanging on the edge of their seats, and the ratings were very good, and I was pleased with that. But the real evidence that the story had gone well came at the end. I was standing there, and people were coming up to me to ask questions and to make comments and that kind of thing, which is always a sign that a speech has gone well. But this one guy who was taller than me, and I'm 6'1", so he was like 6'5". He's a big guy, and he had lots of hair and a huge beard. So this was a formidable. He looked like a grizzly bear. I mean, he was just gigantic and big beard and everything. And he pushed everybody else out of the way, and he came barreling up to me, and I'm looking at him like, what's going on here? Is this guy going to kill me? Yeah. Is this my worst critic? What's happening here? And he threw his arms around me and gave me this gigantic hug, and he lifted me up, and he said, tears were running down his cheeks, and he said, I just want to tell you, my son is autistic, and what you described is of losing the ability to read other people's emotions is just like autism, and it really helped me to understand what my son is going through. And by the time he was done telling me about his son, but we were both in tears. I mean, it was such a moving moment. So to find that moment in front of an audience is just incredible.
Thank you for sharing as well. Now I have two more questions, and these are questions coming from our GTEx member. We have a group called a Facebook group called Explode Your Coaching Business Group, and we have Jason Cohen, which is asking, what is the perfect mix of how and why when speaking?
It's a great question. I love it. Yeah. The answer is you want to address the why question rather right at the beginning of a speech. And so one way to think about a speech is it's your job as a speaker to move the audience from why, which is where they start. Why am I here? Why do I care? Why is this important? Why should I listen to this speech? If you answer that question early on and quickly in the first few minutes, either with a great story or with an interesting statement about your topic that intrigues and draws the audience in, then they're going to start asking how questions. Okay, I see why now. How do I get started? How do I do this? And so a simple test for success with an audience is if they, at the end when you do Q&A, if they're asking how questions, that means you've been successful because they bought your basic message. Okay, I agree, we should do X. Now, how do we get started? If they're still asking why questions, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Then you haven't succeeded. So your job as a speaker is to move the audience from why to how. And that means, to answer this question specifically, you want to address the why question right at the top, either implicitly or explicitly, either with a story or with some with statements about why you're there and what you're talking about. And then if you do that right and you persuade the audience that this is why what we're talking about is important, then they'll start asking the how questions, and they'll naturally move to the how.
Thank you very much. From the why to the how. And then we have last question, which is from Scott Murden. And the question is, who are your favorite speakers and why do you like them?
Many of my favorite speakers are historical, and I use their examples over and over again when I'm coaching. Martin Luther King, for example. I have studied the I Have a Dream speech endlessly because it's so good. And it's a 17-minute speech. The last 7 minutes of that speech were ad-libbed. Many people don't know that. And that makes it even more extraordinary to me. In terms of,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so study the speech because what's interesting is the whole pattern of the way he attacks the speech changes once he starts ad-libbing, and that's when he really starts soaring, and it really gets amazing. And well, we could talk for an hour just about that speech.
That's another interview.
Another one I love at a very different, much lower key way is one of the most viewed talks of all time on TED, which is Sir Ken Robinson's Why Schools Kill Creativity. That's a great talk, and he makes that look effortless, although it was planned and it was rehearsed. But he has a way of delivering that makes it just feel like a conversation, and ever so casual, and yet course, he knows exactly what he's doing, and it's a brilliant speech, and it really skewers the idea of what goes wrong in a schoolhouse. So that's a brilliant one. And then I have to salute. Because here in the U.S. we're just about to hand power over to a new president, so I have to salute our departing president, President Obama, because his 8 years as president have not been without controversy, let's say. But the one thing just about everybody agrees on is that he's a brilliant speaker, and his farewell speech was amazing, as well as many other speeches. So you can learn a lot. One of from studying Obama's speeches, one of the things he's particularly good at, and this is something that is not easy for people to do, is he makes speeches, and of course he's working off a teleprompter, which most business speakers, professional speakers don't, but in most situations, and that makes it even harder. So he's got another hurdle to jump over, because teleprompters can really make your speech worse if you don't know how to use them. But he's a master at it. But anyway, what he does is he leaves enough room in his speech for the audience to respond. He makes that speech feel like a conversation when he's at his best. And that's an extraordinary thing. That's what we crave. And when one of the best things that people say about speakers nowadays is, boy, it really felt like a conversation, even though, of course, the guy or gal up on the podium, up on the stage, was doing most of the talking, literally. If it feels like a conversation, if the speaker shows that he or she cares about the audience's response. And that's one of the things that Obama is particularly good at. So I, for one, will miss him immensely.
Nick, I would keep you here and ask you a question for the next 5 hours, but I know you have a social life, so and also you have your business to run, so it's time. I think I'm gonna let you go. And with the last final question, which is, how can people get in touch with you?
Just go to the website. We have forms there that you can connect with. info@publicwords.com. So that's our website, publicwords.com.
Brilliant. I'm going to put the website and also the email in the show notes. So make sure you connect with Nick. Let him know what did you enjoy about this interview. And if you are a speaker, make sure you connect with him for getting coaching for your speeches. I mean, you see what he can do, right?
Thank you so much.
You're really a master, and I'm really honored and privileged to have you on our show. So thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and good luck with the podcast. You're doing a great job.
Thanks a lot. And now back to our listeners. You guys, if you enjoyed the show, first of all, make sure that you subscribe to Explode Your Coaching Business Show. Then you make sure you give us a review, leave a comment. Let us know, what did you enjoy about this podcast? What did you learn from Nick Morgan? We will love to hear from you. Now, up until next episode, from me, Simone Vincenzi, and Nick Morgan, is everything. See you next time. Ciao.